The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you could grab your seats, please, I'd appreciate it. My name, like the good MC said, is Chief Petty Officer Robert Wilcox. I'm the CDA Formation Chief. So I'm going to step off with our last keynote speaker of the day, and I'm just going to quickly introduce him and then hand the stage over to him. And I'm actually quite interested. I read his bio, and I'm extremely impressed at the amount of stuff he has done at such a young age. So well done, sir. So it's my pleasure to introduce Christopher Rassi, a leader in global humanitarian efforts and a champion for human security. Based in Geneva, Switzerland, Christopher has a background in law and now serves as the Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of the Secretary General at International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescents, a role he has held since 2020. In this position, he plays a critical part in the IFRC senior leadership team, overseeing key areas such as strategy, people, and safeguarding. Christopher's career with the IFRC has taken him across the globe, including Southeast Asia, where he led the IFRC's delegation in Bangkok and represented the organization at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. His work has also spanned roles with the United Nations, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. In addition to his professional contributions, Christopher is active on several boards and frequently lectures at universities worldwide. His expertise and dedication continue to shape the IFRC's mission and the broader field of international humanitarian law. Mr. Rassi, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to you all. I hope you've had plenty of sugar and coffee because we just have one session left to go. I'll try and be engaging, and hopefully it's an entertaining session for you. It's a pleasure to be back in Kingston and to be part of such important discussions at a time when we're grappling with some of the most challenging risks to human security. You've heard about a lot of these already. Maybe I'll just quickly name a few. Political instability and a strained multilateral system, increasing extreme weather events, growing threats of epidemics, record-breaking levels of migration and displacement, an increased number of armed conflicts, growing economic security throughout, and a lack of respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. One by one, you can sometimes deal with them, but they're not isolated. They're deeply intertwined. They catalyze and multiply each other. And today I want to focus not only on these risks, but also to encourage us to think about concrete solutions and to consider the specific and crucial contributions of local actors towards addressing these challenges. I've been invited here as a senior leader of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, the IFRC. We're an international membership organization founded more than a century ago. We give a voice to the collective of national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, of which there are now 191, including the Canadian Red Cross. And we had the pleasure of hearing from Kelsey just in the previous session. And you know the Canadian Red Cross very well. We coordinate their international responses to global crises. We build their capacities. And we set high standards of accountability and integrity for the whole membership. And our national societies work in accordance with humanitarian principles and are identified by the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblems. They are enshrined in the bedrock documents of international humanitarian law and national legislation as national organizations able to carry forward the humanitarian work in even the most remote areas around the globe. And they are auxiliaries to the national authorities, supporting in all the realms that we've discussed: disaster response, health, climate action, and so much more. And they provide support to vulnerable communities, including migrants and displaced people. And they're often the ones bearing the brunt of the operational response in crisis settings. I'd like to share with you some of the experiences from around the world and the lived reality of these national societies who are present before, during, and after every crisis. I want to share what they are experiencing in terms of global risks to human security, on the barriers to humanitarian action they are facing, and what we are collectively trying to do to address these challenges. And along the way, I'd like to encourage you to think about what human security would look like if a human-centered approach was always taken, rather than, as often happens, where it's viewed as an afterthought. And what are some of the big global risks we're facing? Well, the first one that we've talked about already, but today is the raising concerns of climate change and extreme weather events. When we set our 10-year strategy 5 years ago, our membership said the greatest challenge of our time was climate change. And we see that now in 2024 as clear as ever. This year alone, we've had over 4,800 climate and weather-related disasters, resulting in more than 8,500 deaths. The biggest killers are floods, followed by extreme temperature, and landslides triggered by rainfall. With well over 9 million people were displaced by climate hazards alone in 2024. The scale and nature of climate-sensitive health risks is shifting as well, and will continue to do so, such as those from vector and waterborne diseases, which are exposing new populations and increasing existing vulnerabilities. From a health angle, there are also some major trends of concern. The COVID pandemic showed us the true gaps in our health systems, including when it comes to preparedness, equity of access to care, and the lack of trust in critical institutions. And none of us want to go back to that again. But COVID will not be the last major epidemic and pandemic that we face. And I was reading yesterday that right now, on the other side of Canada, scientists are investigating if a teenager suffering from bird flu has a form of the virus that has mutated to make it more transmissible among people. Disasters have multiple physical and mental health impacts as well. And many communities face multiple disasters, be they climate-related, health-related, or social. And many communities are being affected by different types of disasters and crises simultaneously. They have barely any time to recover from one crisis before another one knocks them off their feet again. And there are, for example, around 120 armed conflicts taking place around the world as we speak. And communities suffering under this violence are often coping with climate and health emergencies at the same time, and their humanitarian needs are skyrocketing. In terms of tackling climate-related emergencies, for example, investment doesn't always follow need. Each year, we at the IFRC undertake a review of the number of disasters globally. We look at how many people are being affected and by what. We also undertake a review of the level of climate and disaster vulnerability across the world and the level of investment in climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. From this research, we determined that there are 7 and 58 countries with very high and high climate vulnerability, respectively. But these countries are nowhere near close to the top of receiving the amount of funding that their vulnerability demands. Actually, for some of the most severe affected, they receive 6 times less funding than the average global funding amount. And the vast majority of the people being left behind are living in fragile or conflict-affected settings. They are being hammered by overlapping compounding risks, and they are receiving less support than those living in lower risk environments. And our network around the world is trying its best to work with these communities to provide humanitarian assistance to people in need, regardless of the cause. But many of our 16 million volunteers and so many of our staff carry out this life-saving work in dangerous and challenging environments, and sometimes without being able to afford proper equipment for safety, transport, and communications. I'll turn to some of the barriers to humanitarian action that are undermining humanitarian principles. You know of the 7 fundamental principles by which the Red Cross and Red Crescent works, and which were officially adopted in 1965. They'll turn 60 next year. Humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. These guide our work, but these are currently being challenged and undermined in many contexts. The principle of humanity is emblematic in this quote from Jean Pictet, one of the founders of modern international humanitarian law. If anyone presents the Red Cross with the well-known and destructive dilemma embodied in the phrase, "Whoever is not with me is against me," may it always reply, "I am with all those who suffer, and that is sufficient." End quote. My worry is that this is no longer sufficient. In the wider world, increasing numbers of people are being encouraged to see the suffering of other people as not their concern, and to react with hostility and even violence to people they are being taught to completely dehumanize and ostracize. Dehumanizing rhetoric is a key major challenge today. Its use denies millions of people of respect for their basic humanity, and it creates an environment that actively endangers affected people and the principled humanitarian actors working to support them. Attacks on civilians, including humanitarian workers, are tragically on the rise, as we've heard, and they're blatant violations of international humanitarian law. Such attacks directly affect the operational capacity of humanitarians to deliver aid, including life-saving services. 2023 was record-breaking in terms of number of attacks and number of humanitarian personnel killed. And this year is on track to be even worse. The vast majority of those affected, around 95%, have been local and national humanitarians that do not get the attention they deserve in international press. For IFRC, it's been a tragic year. 30 staff and volunteers from our national societies died while on duty in just the first 9 months of 2024. But all but three of them in violent attacks with missiles or bullets. And this is close to 1 dead humanitarian every week. And this figure, horrifying as it is, does not include many who have died whilst not on duty, many of whom were killed in attacks on civilian areas in crisis contexts, and some along with their families. This data does not even include all categories of people injured, kidnapped, arbitrarily detained, threatened, for which there are many more victims and teams affected. In October in Geneva, we honored their memory. We remembered Mohammed Al-Amari, who met our team in Gaza in February. After that meeting, he was killed hours later, while rushing to give medical relief to people in need. We remembered Amit Man, who died on the 7th of October, 2023, when she was killed in a clinic in Kibbutz Bedi. The spread of misinformation and disinformation through social media and other channels further affects the safety of humanitarian workers and the people in their care. And the persistence in threats and acts of violence directed at humanitarian and healthcare workers further undermines our work. And sometimes there are also bureaucratic and legal barriers, such as entry of critical items, including medical and telecommunications equipment, or rules limiting consignee authority, which limit our ability to act everywhere for everyone. Then there's challenges to impartiality. Impartiality requires us to support the people in greatest need. However, this is challenging in a world that sees certain people as less worthy and less human than others, and where donors want to invest in helping certain people and not others. Some of the largest crises remain neglected and underfunded. Sudan being one of the clearest examples. And the narratives used by some often focused on a sense of solidarity. And that support is very much needed, as in the case of Ukraine and surrounding countries. But such solidarity narratives present humanitarian aid as an extension of wider political and military support, which can undermine perceptions of impartiality. And then there's challenges to neutrality. Similarly, the perception of neutrality and independence is being tested in acute contexts where emotions are strong and public outrage is growing daily, such as in the case in the international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and in the context of ongoing mass-scale humanitarian crises in Palestine and Lebanon. Neutrality also means engaging with all parties, yet this can lead to extreme criticism. We have seen public authorities questioning if neutrality and impartiality is helping the enemy. We have also seen some authorities effectively declaring entire populations as legitimate targets for attacks based on their national, ethnic, or religious identity. And this rhetoric, along with attempts to provide blanket justifications for attacks against civilians, including humanitarian and healthcare workers, should never be allowed to become the new normal. In some contexts, we see attempts to create a hierarchy of people worthy of help or not, based on arbitrary criteria rather than on creating different categories of crises, with a deservedly warm welcome for some and restrictive and hardline policies for others. And this undermines both humanity and neutrality. So what are we trying to do as IFRC and as humanitarians? We recognize that beyond these barriers, there are also some wider sector challenges to effective humanitarian action. These include, in particular, assuming we know what people want rather than asking and listening and working together, silos that don't talk to each other, such as between development, climate, and humanitarian actors, and a focus on short-term band-aid solutions that don't build resilience to future crises. Locally led action is critical to helping us ensure that our work delivers on the needs and priorities of communities. That's the what they want. And moreover, at the community level, silos and headings are irrelevant. There are needs and there are solutions. In October, we held our international conference where national societies sit side by side with their governments, the states party to the Geneva Conventions. We worked together to develop resolutions despite the world we live in, such as those adopted on IHL, locally led humanitarian action, anticipatory action, and disaster risk governance. However, for me, the biggest inspiration was talking with national societies who are achieving amazing things at the local level in the face of extreme adversity. And allow me to talk through some of these examples. In Sudan, where we are trying to address access challenges, it is more than 500 days since hostilities have dramatically increased in Sudan. More than 10 million people are displaced. 8 million are internally displaced, and 2.2 million displaced to neighboring countries. 70 to 80% of the healthcare facilities are no longer functioning. Half of the population, about 25 million, is food insecure. Floods have affected more than 7 states, and more than 490,000 people are affected, and more than 140,000 are displaced. The last peace talks in August 2024 in Switzerland all but failed. This is a neglected crisis. Funding for the Sudan appeal, both for the Red Cross and Red Crescent and for the UN, ranges from 30 to 40%. In talking with the leaders of the Sudan Red Crescent, critical challenges they shared include violence against humanitarian personnel and assets, in particular on the healthcare system, of which there have been 280 incidents since the beginning of the conflict. 16 of their volunteers have been killed since mid-April last year, and with many attacked in their own offices, while clearly identified as a neutral and impartial humanitarian actor. They are present in all states in Sudan. They have about 9,000 volunteers, where other humanitarian organizations struggle to have enough people to actually work in Sudan. They're active in all the areas we'd want them to be: health, water, sanitation and hygiene, and relief and cash. And when possible, their volunteers and staff collect dead bodies, identify them, and undertake dignified burials in very challenging environments. In terms of access, our members are already inside, present throughout the territory, and trusted members of affected communities. And in Sudan and in other countries, they still face these threats and attacks, as well as the administrative and access issues that I presented. Operating is not easy, with shortages of staff, challenges with telecommunications and the transport of goods. Their commitment must be matched by concrete actions of support from the rest of us. This includes a guarantee of unimpeded humanitarian access, cross-border and cross-line, regardless, as well as for more resources to quickly supply to different parts of the country. In Palestine, we're trying to protect humanitarian workers. The Palestine Red Crescent Society plays a central role in receiving and providing aid in Gaza, as we've already learned, as well as responding to the needs in the West Bank. It's the primary provider of emergency medical services with ambulances, hospitals, and triage points. Volunteers or staff are continually facing threats and attacks, leaving members dead, severely injured, and arbitrarily detained. They also face systematic obstructions impeding their movement and their ability to provide emergency medical attention. On the logistics level, they are supported by other members of our federation, such as the Canadian Red Cross and the Egyptian Red Crescent. And the Egyptians are the sole logistics manager and consignee able to operate in Sinai, with a large-scale logistics operation to deliver aid into Gaza. However, since the closure of the Rafah crossing, it has only been able to send in a very small number of trucks and has had to manage the large backlog, including by increasing its warehousing capacity. It also supports evacuees from Gaza through 61 service points. And yet all of these efforts fall short without guaranteed protections for humanitarian personnel and a sharp, immediate increase of aid allowed in throughout the Strip. In Afghanistan, we're continuing to provide humanitarian services in extremely challenging times. Afghanistan is experiencing the compounding effects of decades of conflict, severe drought, food insecurity, climate-related disasters, earthquakes, floods, displacement, and gaps in health services. A staggering 28 million people, a full 2/3 of the population, need humanitarian assistance. 1.7 million Afghans have been forced to return from surrounding countries, and there are 4.3 million internally displaced. Acute malnutrition is threatening the lives and health of 3.2 million children aged under 5 years old and 840,000 pregnant and lactating women. The Afghan Red Crescent plays a critical role plugging the gaps that no external party can even see, let alone address. The National Society is present across the country with 300 health facilities, almost 27,000 volunteers, and almost 4,000 staff. It has recently had to move into areas that are new to them, social protection, as new gaps and needs appeared, including assistance to widows, people with mental health needs and disabilities, and injection drug users, among others. This summer, in 2024, I visited Afghanistan to see how we operate and how we can instill change and preserve the humanitarian space, despite archaic restrictions, such as forcing staff and volunteers to work in separate offices, being accompanied by men to and from work. Today, we have some 700 female staff and almost 7,000 female volunteers helping communities across the country. And to better support them, we've scaled up our own office, seeking to work as we do everywhere in the world, despite these challenges, by also trying to encourage positive change, not shying away and not ignoring a situation. In Lebanon, we are strengthening our collective response, where the widespread acceptance of the Lebanese Red Cross makes it such a crucial local actor today. Earlier this month, I visited Lebanon in the middle of the ongoing conflict. I was there for solidarity reasons and to launch our emergency appeal in support of the Lebanese Red Cross. I visited operations, met political leaders, and was inspired by our staff and volunteers. What always strikes me about the Lebanese Red Cross is that despite the challenges in the country, and there have been many over the decades, it remains strong, focused, and people-centered. When the world is focused on military and political solutions, our network is focused on human solutions. No matter what is happening, we ensure that people are protected and that their basic needs, shelter, food, first aid, very basic, are met, and that our teams have what they need to do their jobs safely. It seems simple, but this is truly an important aspect of human security. In Lebanon, I met Ahmed, a 14-year-old boy living in a shelter in a part of Beirut. His family left their home a few weeks earlier when, at 1 a.m, bombs started falling in their town. Ahmed spent the rest of the night petrified on the beach and is now in a shelter run by the Lebanese Red Cross, unable yet to go back to school, but helped by volunteers to get access to lessons online instead. I met Zara too, an education student who'd fled to the same shelter on September 23rd. Without it, and without his volunteer staff, she told me, she doesn't know where she'd be. And these are just two of the millions whose lives right now are difficult, turbulent, but made that little more secure by a focus on people at the center. Globally, we are focusing on migration in all its forms, with the only goal of saving lives. The latest estimates are that there are more than 200 million migrants around the world, and more than 120 million who have been forcibly displaced from their homes, 70 million internally, and more than 50 million displaced across borders as asylum seekers and refugees. The number of refugees has tripled in the past decade. And despite the perception of refugees fleeing to the global north, we see that 75% of all refugees are living in low and middle income countries. And 70% of all refugees are living in neighboring countries from where they fled. We also see high vulnerabilities and critical needs for people on the move along migratory routes, across the Darien jungle in Central America, across the Sahel and West and North Africa, in the Balkans, and in Southeast Asia. For many people traveling along these routes, there are daily threats to their safety, to their human dignity, and to their ability to access the most essential and basic support. And the risk of death is always present. More than 63,000 migrants have died at borders throughout their journeys in the last decade. Our IFRC network is at borders and throughout the journeys, forming humanitarian chains of protection. This includes our humanitarian service points, locations along migratory routes where people can access humanitarian support on an impartial and neutral basis. And one humanitarian service point in particular is especially worth mentioning. It's our humanitarian service point on board the Ocean Viking vessel in the central Mediterranean. On board the Ocean Viking, we provide the same services that we provide on land to migrants and refugees rescued at sea. This includes basic healthcare, psychosocial support, food, and water. And to date, we have rescued more than 7,000 people in distress at sea, including more than 2,000 unaccompanied minors. In March this year, I personally witnessed this operation on board the Ocean Viking. What I saw in Port in Sicily was a concrete tool to save lives while trying to navigate the storm of political difficulties. I saw a team of dedicated and skilled staff and volunteers who shared with me human stories of rescue, of survival, and of death. I'm pleased to be with you here today and to share some of these stories and to bring some hope as well as to draw attention to major challenges. Our Red Cross and Red Crescent personnel are experts on the part of human security in all the settings that we're discussing, and not only in conflict settings. While I am in Kingston here today, my CEO and Secretary General is accepting the Sydney Peace Prize far, far away. He's accepting it in a time where there doesn't seem to be too much peace. There is an irony of focusing on human security when the world is perhaps more focused on the second word, security, and not prioritizing the human component. Even in my conversations over the last few days before coming to Kingston, when I was in New York, the most interesting and crucial discussions were about the political and security elements. The human-centered approach, if it is mentioned at all, is often mentioned as an afterthought. Having seen the bravery and skill of Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteers in action in some of the world's most troubled places, I can assure you that it needs to be highlighted and viewed as every bit as important. If I leave you with anything, perhaps a few final reflections. Please do not securitize all issues. Together, we need to think about how to better profile the human element so it is not an afterthought and viewed as something nice to be done when feasible. And please allow me to put forward a final challenge. In all of the discussions on problems and solutions, think about what is the local perspective. What is this perspective of the community? And are we listening to community members? Because when it comes to solutions, we have to think about what local leadership looks like. And are we working with local communities and supporting them to take action? And if not, we should be. Thank you.